Science shouldn't feel like a closed door. Welcome to Human Verified, your backstage pass to the world of high stakes research and the business of staying alive. My name is Gina Winchester, a Native American scientist, professor, author, and I've created this space where we swap dense academic jargon for fresh, no nonsense insights. Whether I'm deconstructing pharmaceutical breakthroughs, clinical trials, or the how this is legal side of STEM business, I'm here to bridge the gap between the lab bench and your daily life. It's rigorous research met with real world storytelling because understanding how science works is the ultimate power move. Cannabis and the DOJ hearings of summer 2026. What happened in that courtroom? In my last article, Zaza Dispos Are Evolving, I looked at how the new laws in 2026 are changing cannabis research, how we check for quality, and what it means for how we group the plant. I pointed out that American cannabis market is finally leaving behind its wild and messy early days. Right now, we are seeing a huge change because the government is ending a decades-long cycle that blocked research. They moved medical cannabis into the Schedule III category, which has fewer restrictions. This move cuts through the red tape and heavy security that used to stop medical trials from happening. Even with this progress, there is still a clear line between medicine and fun. Recreational cannabis and large farm crops are still stuck under the very restrictive Schedule I rules, which means the recreational side of the business can't use any of these new scientific discoveries yet. To deal with this gap, the DEA set up a quick federal hearing in Arlington, Virginia. They want to decide if they should move all other types of cannabis into the Schedule III Group 2. This event has caused a lot of arguments because the list of approved speakers only includes groups that are against legalizing cannabis. Even so, the judge in charge has clear orders from the White House to keep things moving fast and finish the process. In the end, if the DOJ recommends rescheduling cannabis to Schedule III, it will permanently remove the walls that stop scientists from doing research. It will also give recreational business owners a huge break on their taxes. Currently, the cannabis industry is much more than a small side market. It is a giant part of our economy. While people mostly talk about recreational use, medical cannabis has actually been the main moneymaker. It drives investments in real estate, creates tech jobs, and brings in a lot of tax money for states. For more detail, check out that human verified editorial I talked about, Zaza Dispos Are Evolving. I point out that for a long time, a tough federal tax rule called Section 280E hurt American cannabis companies. This rule stopped them from taking normal business tax deductions, which led to painful tax rates as high as 80%. These companies also couldn't list their stocks on the big US exchanges, so they had to use smaller markets to get the money they needed to grow. Everything shifted in June of 2026. A Florida company called TrueLeave refocused its medical business and, after passing all the federal rules, became the first U.S. cannabis company to list on the New York Stock Exchange. This big moment has major implications in both cannabis and the U.S. economy, something I look forward to exploring more in 2027 as new data comes in. As we move ahead, the industry is split in two different directions: local shops and strictly controlled pharmaceutical paths. Companies that want the FDA to approve their cannabis as a real prescription have a long and pricey journey ahead of them. Since cannabis is a plant, the FDA makes researchers map out its botanical fingerprint. This means they have to track everything from the dirt it grows in to its genetics and pass safety tests before they can even test it on humans. Even though people have fought against it for years for political and financial reasons, this industry has finally made it to the big leagues, and it is only getting bigger. Most of this change took decades to happen, and the hearings that started on June 29, 2026, about how we classify cannabis will shape much of what happens next. Shane Pennington, administrative law expert, analyzing the sweeping nature of the DOJ's text. We're not talking about a couple of molecules or product types recommended for Schedule 3. It looks like they're addressing all of cannabis that's Scheduled 1 and saying all of that should go into Schedule 3. Though the hearings had little press coverage, with the world focused on the crisis in the Strait of Hormuz and the euphoria of the World Cup, we have to keep talking about cannabis. The legislative, regulatory, and economic implications of reclassifying cannabis could lead to changes in legal frameworks affecting real, everyday Americans. So let's talk about it. What happened in the hearings, and what comes next? The shutout. The hearings held at the Drug Enforcement Administration were supposed to be a historic moment, but they instead turned into a major controversy. From late June to just last week, these sessions were supposed to change the trajectory of how the government handled the plant. But the biggest headline wasn't about the science or the policy, it was about who was locked out of the room. The trouble started with who actually got to speak. According to strict federal regulations, you can't just walk in and share your perspective. You have to legally prove that you're an interested person who will be directly harmed or negatively affected by changing the law. When the government ordered the hearings, more than 160 different people and organizations rushed to apply for a seat at the table. But when the DEA finally published the official guest list, the cannabis industry was left in absolute shock. Out of 160 applicants, the agency approved just 7 outside participants, and every single one of them was an anti-reform advocate dedicated to keeping cannabis heavily restricted. The roster included anti-legalization groups, drug screening associations, a coalition of conservative state attorney generals, and individual anti-reform medical specialists. Not a single pro-reform advocacy group, cannabis trade association, or independent scientist was selected to testify. This total shutout has sparked an outcry from major advocacy groups and industry leaders who argue that the DEA deliberately created a heavily biased process. Even pharmaceutical developers trying to create legal cannabis medications protested their exclusion, warning that the agency made a fatal procedural error. By shutting out the very people the law affects most, the DEA may have created an unfair process that could easily cause a federal judge to throw out the entire final ruling in a court down the line. Matthews Schwitz, Marijuana Policy Project. Advocates have spent decades fighting the DEA, trying to remove cannabis from Schedule 1. But the advocates won't be in the room, and the DEA, which has set up a process that looks from the outside as if it's designed to ram through a predetermined result of one kind or another, is suddenly representing the reform perspective and saying, in effect, we got this. Will this truncated and opponent-dominated hearing build a public record robust enough to withstand judicial scrutiny later, or will any victory be unnecessarily vulnerable to challenge? Experts challenge that this was predetermined. Was this just judicial theater? Does the DEA have any intention of truly considering reclassification, or was it all a charade? The temperature. Inside the DEA's North Courtroom, the vibe was surprisingly calm, contrasted with the historic policy shift hanging in the balance. People watching the classroom drama unfold quickly started calling it the quietest fight of the DEA's life because the agency seemed to be intentionally keeping its head down. The hearing itself was split into 2 very lopsided parts. On the very first day, the government brought in just 2 federal witnesses who argued that cannabis does indeed have real medical value and it doesn't carry immediate lethal toxicity risks. But after the quick opening move, the government stepped aside. For the next 7 days, 7 different anti-cannabis organizations completely dominated the floor, throwing a mountain of prohibitionist testimony into the record. What really caught the attention of legal experts was the DEA's total silence during those final 7 days. The government legal team essentially sat back, watched the clock tick, offered almost zero objections, and refused to question or cross examine any of the anti cannabis witnesses. This passive behavior has left outsiders trying to guess what is actually happening behind the scenes, leading to two main theories. The first is what people are calling the done deal theory. The thinking here is that the DEA is simply doing the bare minimum because the decision has already been made for them. Back in December 2025, President Trump issued an executive order explicitly telling the Attorney General to cut through the usual bureaucratic red tape and finally move to Schedule 3. If this theory is right, the DEA treats this entire multi day hearing as a boring, formal box checking exercise that they just have to get through. But is it done for Schedule 3 or for Schedule 1? That is the question. How can the legal process work if scientists and data aren't in the room? Legal analyst Harris Slowowski. The decision not to allow proponents a chance to participate raised flags for me. This strategy could make sense whether DEA is a true proponent or an opponent of the proposed rule. The complacency we see in this hearing could just be employees who don't care about the outcome. Either they don't want to put on a strong showing and are just doing the bare minimum to save face, or they have already been told Schedule 3 is a done deal. But the second, much more worrying theory is that the DEA is walking straight into a legal trap. Critics point out that by staying completely silent, the agency allowed a wave of unchecked anti cannabis medical testimony to flow directly into the official government record without anybody pushing back. By leaving that testimony unchallenged, the DEA might be weakening its own position, making it much easier for corporate or state opponents to successfully appeal and overturn the final ruling in court later on. Corporate counsel for MMJ International Holdings on the structural vulnerability of the record. By denying standing to legitimate scientific developers and reform advocates under 21 CFR 1300.01b, the agency has compromised the integrity of the administrative record. If the final rule is ultimately challenged, a federal appellate court may look at this lopsided selection process as a fatal procedural error under the Administrative Procedure Act. The most direct procedural attack is that the Trump administration completely bypassed the mandatory legal blueprint for federal rulemaking. Under the APA, federal agencies cannot simply change major rules overnight without giving the public, industry stakeholders, and local governments a chance to review the data and submit formal feedback. The states argue that Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche's April 2026 final order, which immediately shifted state licensed medical marijuana to Schedule 3, was procedurally improper because it skipped the standard public notice and comment period entirely. Because it was finalized by executive decree before the administrative hearings even began, the AGs argue it must be vacated as arbitrary, capricious, and not in accordance with the law. But does this help or hurt the chances for reclassification? In one way, public and state feedback would ensure that scientists and medical experts could be a part of the conversation. But then again, would that open the door to more prohibitionist groups gumming up the process with the ultimate goal of halting it altogether? Would the courts just be overloaded with appeals no matter what happened? But maybe all of these court cases weren't a total waste of time or a missed opportunity for real change. In a shocking twist, the opposition's strategy completely backfired on them in the final days of a courtroom battle. Anti-legalization states called the California sheriff to testify that federal changes would cause black market crime to skyrocket. Instead, under intense questioning from the Justice Department lawyers, the sheriff admitted to the judge that a strictly regulated legal market actually helps law enforcement. He confessed that nearly all the illegal black market pot comes from completely unlicensed operations, which totally contradicted the state's original arguments and dealt a massive blow to the idea that legalization drives crime. So later in this article, I'll talk a little bit about how rescheduling and possible decriminalization of cannabis might affect the federal and state levels of our larger than life prison system. That court case in DC, which is separate from the DEA hearings, but also occurring at the same time, is setting up possible major appeals to any decision we see from the DEA hearings. Any day now, the DC court will decide on an emergency request to temporarily freeze the 2026 executive order that sparked this whole debate. If the court grants this freeze, the current federal protections for state licensed medical cannabis will instantly vanish, throwing the whole industry right back into legal chaos. If the court refuses to freeze the rules, it will move on to a full review of the case. By November or December 2026, oral arguments will focus on whether the government overstepped its legal bounds by creating a complicated split-tier rules system without getting any explicit permission from Congress first. All around, you can see how complicated this process is. In the end, though, I think it's a good thing. Personally, I'm all for federal medical cannabis regulations. Medical cannabis is not legal at the federal level in a way that is implementable nationwide. Although state licensed medical cannabis and specific FDA approved products were reclassified to Schedule 3 federally in April, it remains federally illegal to possess or distribute cannabis in all 50 states. States set their own laws, resulting in 40 states and DC permitting comprehensive medical use, while Idaho, Kansas, and American Samoa prohibit it entirely. This goes back to what that California sheriff said. Currently, the laws are so conflicting that besides the lack of quality control or R&D for medical purposes, arrests and burdens on the justice system remain rampant. I would like to see this federal legislative shift because we need to regulate the quality of the products on the market to protect consumers, and we need those R&D studies to show us new ways to combat pain and other medical applications going forward. As I pointed out in Zaza Dispos Are Evolving, right now, pain management options focus on opioid-based drugs. Medical cannabis research could provide a much-needed and far less addictive alternative to giving patients legal opium. Those international treaties we signed in the 1960s. Opponents of rescheduling cannabis argue that loosening the rules for state-level medical systems violates strict global agreements that the U.S. signed up for decades ago to control narcotic drugs. Shane Pennington, counsel at Porter, Wright, Morris, and Arthur. Courts have held that, to the extent that DEA can follow HHS's scientific and medical findings without compromising treaty compliance, it must do so. Asked what recourse advocates might have if the DEA were to maintain that global drug treaties prohibit rescheduling lower than Schedule 2, Pennington noted that constitutional arguments would serve as the basis for challenging DEA's decision in federal court. The showdown between this old international treaty and the recent DEA hearings boils down to a head-on collision between two completely different worlds: global diplomacy and U.S. science. During the courtroom hearings, everyone was hyper-focused on medical data, debating whether cannabis actually works as medicine and if it can be used safely. But the 1961 treaty is a rigid global anti-drug pact that completely ignores modern medical science. Instead, it strictly commands member nations to keep heavy top-tier restrictions on cannabis to stop international drug smuggling. This creates a massive legal mess in three major ways. First, the laws are actively fighting each other. Government lawyers and cannabis advocates argue that U.S. law forces the DEA to loosen restrictions if the science proves the plant has medical value. However, opposing states point to a different part of the exact same law, which says global treaties override domestic opinions. They argue the DEA's hands are tied up by our international promises, no matter what the science says. Second, there is a huge gap in how the government would actually enforce the rules. The global treaty requires the government to heavily police the entire supply chain. Normal loosened drug categories simply aren't built for that kind of intense oversight. Opposing states argue that loosening the rules creates a dangerous regulatory gap that breaks our global promise, while the administration is trying to awkwardly patch the problem by inventing a clunky hybrid rule on thin air. Then it comes down to a battle of science versus an unchangeable diplomatic contract. The hearing treated cannabis like an evolving medical question, but the treaty treats it like a permanent promise written in stone. Opposing states are betting that federal judges won't care about the medical breakthroughs or patient benefits. Instead, they're banking on the court's ruling that the government broke a historic international agreement. If the judges agree, all the scientific evidence won't matter at all, and the entire effort to change the law could be killed on a legal technicality. What comes next? What happens in this federal court carries a lot more weight than any internal agency debates. If the judge decides that the government skipped essential regulatory steps when setting up this new system, the court could strike down the entire rescheduling effort altogether. Now that the official hearings have wrapped up, the path forward comes down to two slow-moving phases. With the initial hearings officially finished, the ball is currently in the court of the presiding administrative law judge. Over the next month or so, both the government and the anti-cannabis groups that are allowed in the room will submit final paperwork summarizing their arguments. Even though the judge is expected to work fast and issue a recommendation by late autumn, there is a catch. No matter what the judge decides, it's just a recommendation. The ultimate power of making any final binding rules belongs entirely to the DEA administrator, Ann Milgram, who can follow the judge's advice, tweak it, or throw it straight into the trash. What some lawmakers are saying. The federal push to move cannabis to Schedule III has split lawmakers along distinct ideological and regional lines. Progressive and moderate reformers generally frame the administrative shift as an overdue, scientifically backed step forward that will unleash economic growth, though many emphasize it does not go far enough. On the other side, conservative hardliners view the transition as a dangerous, short-sighted policy shift that creates severe public safety hazards and serves as a backdoor bailout for large corporate interests. Senator Cory Booker, Democrat, New Jersey. Finally, the federal government has loosened the decades-long policy that treated marijuana like heroin and methamphetamine, a policy researchers, elected officials, and everyday Americans have long understood was wrong. Rescheduling marijuana as a Schedule III substance will bring financial and operational benefits to legal businesses. But there is still a long way to go. Unauthorized possession remains a crime. People will still be prosecuted, detained, and deported for marijuana offenses. This is why we must deschedule cannabis altogether. Senator Ted Budd, Republican, North Carolina. Rescheduling marijuana to a Schedule III substance and putting more money in the pockets of marijuana companies is a short-sighted policy decision that will have detrimental effects on the health and safety of Americans, especially our nation's youth. We should not be handing tax breaks to bad actors and foreign drug cartels to advertise a drug that will harm Americans. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat, New York. It is great news that the DEA is finally recognizing that cannabis restrictions should be eased. However, this is only a first step. Congress must still act to fully deschedule cannabis, pass comprehensive criminal justice reform, and ensure that small businesses, especially minority-owned ones, can thrive in a safe, regulated market. Representative Earl Blumenauer, Democrat, Oregon. While moving cannabis to Schedule 3 is a historic administrative milestone that will finally end the crushing and unfair tax burdens of Section 280E on state legal operators, we cannot lose sight of the end goal. This process underlines the reality that the executive branch can only do so much. True justice requires Congress to completely strip cannabis from the Controlled Substances Act. Governor Jared Polis, Democrat, Colorado. This federal shift to Schedule 3 is a massive victory for economic common sense and public health. For years, states like Colorado have proven that regulating cannabis like alcohol works. Easing these federal restrictions will allow our homegrown small businesses to compete fairly, invest in safety, and finally break free from federal tax codes that treat legitimate businesses like criminal enterprises. Hardline anti-cannabis Republicans are pushing back aggressively against President Trump's executive order, sparking an intense internal battle within the GOP. This conflict exposes a philosophical rift that flips traditional political talking points on their heads. The business-focused wing of the GOP embraces the president's view that legal medical cannabis creates jobs and deserves tax breaks, while social conservatives view any relaxation as a slippery slope toward full recreational legalization. This turns the classic conservative defense of states' rights upside down as anti-cannabis lawmakers now demand sweeping federal intervention to lock down borders and stop cannabis from crossing state lines. By forcing federal judges to handle the lawsuit, hardline Republicans could quietly kill the policy on a legal technicality without publicly attacking a popular president. This fight proves federal cannabis reform is no longer a simple partisan issue, but a full-on clash pitting populist economics against traditional drug policy. And that political debate doesn't even include justice system reform yet. Many people assume moving cannabis to a milder drug category will automatically fix our broken criminal justice system, empty federal prison cells, and stop arrests. However, this historic change will have virtually zero impact on the prison pipeline and will not release a single person currently behind bars. The reality stems from how Congress wrote our drug laws decades ago. For most illegal substances, lower classifications automatically mean lighter punishments. But Congress carved marijuana out specifically by name and weight, meaning anyone trafficking large amounts still faced mandatory minimum sentences of 10 years to life, regardless of its category. Because reclassification does not federally legalize the everyday recreational market, a multi-billion-dollar illegal trade will continue to thrive, and agencies like the DEA will keep aggressively hunting down cross-border smuggling networks. Reclassification also offers absolutely no retroactive relief, leaving behind the roughly 3,000 nonviolent offenders currently sitting in federal custody. Truthfully, changing a federal classification will barely make a dent in arrest rates because local police and state troopers carry out most arrests. Shifting cannabis to the same category as an anabolic steroid or ketamine does not force any state to change its local criminal codes. To truly dismantle the prison pipeline, stop everyday arrests, and undo decades of convictions, shuffling cannabis around on a government list is structurally inadequate. Real criminal justice reform requires Congress to step up, fully remove marijuana from the Controlled Substances Act, and regulate it like alcohol or tobacco. The shadow of Schedule 2. Botching this whole process has opened the door to a trap that the legal world is quietly buzzing about. Landing the plant in Schedule 2 instead of Schedule 3. Even though health officials recommend the less restrictive Schedule 3, the administrative judge is not a rubber stamp and must weigh all courtroom evidence neutrally. If the judge pivots to Schedule 2 instead, which is a category reserved for heavy hitters like fentanyl and oxycodone, it would trigger an absolute financial headache for the cannabis industry. While Schedule 2 formally recognizes medical value, it fails to lift the industry's biggest hurdle, which is that Section 280E tax rule we discussed earlier. Since this rule blocks standard business write offs for Schedule 1 and 2 drugs, landing Schedule 2 would leave corporate operators buried under the exact same crushing tax burdens they face today. The human verified perspective. The truth is, this is democracy. No one denies that this is a complicated issue. And the reality is, this isn't over. In the coming articles on this topic, I want to dive into what this really means going forward. As the federal government moves in with new regulations, tribal nations are uniquely positioned to show the rest of the country how it's done. Take the historic partnership between my tribe, the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi, and the state of Michigan. By plugging directly into the state's official tracking systems and entering the licensed wholesale market, dispensaries like ours, called Rolling Embers, are proving that defending your independence does not mean you have to work in isolation. Instead, tribal sovereignty and strict safety standards can go hand in hand, creating a secure, transparent market that protects everyday consumers while keeping the community's financial future safe. Looking ahead, this balance of independence and cooperation offers a brilliant blueprint for the entire industry. While corporations scramble to redesign their products around new federal THC limits, tribal regulated markets are giving a masterclass in how to build a business that lasts. They prove that you can achieve economic success without losing your soul, keeping operations firmly rooted in helping real people. How laws in tribal nations conflict with state and federal laws is an interesting legal topic in medical science and consumer protection that I'm going to explore in the next editorial in this series. Thank you for spending this time with me today.